Welcome to the Plain Truth Discussion, where no conspiratorial rock will be left unturned, no mainstream propaganda will go unchallenged, and all existing reality boxes will be shattered. Piloting the discussion, as always, is the jet-setting international man of mystery, codenamed Plain. Co-piloting the storm clouds are Time Bomb veterans Herm, myself, and of course Oolong, the tea-drinking rabbit. Tonight's special guest is our very own disaster cat, also known as Melody. Tonight's frequency is being broadcast across secure Time Monk radio channels, so sit back, buckle your seatbelts, and ensure all overhead bins are secured, because we are definitely in for a very turbulent ride. Tonight's topic is future viewing, and I will open it up to Plain and Melody.
Well, thank you, Herm. So today we're going to discuss future viewing, and by that, of course, we're talking about psychic thoughts, how we can see the future in different methods, and some of the people in the past or the present who have done it, and how they are going about doing it. And as a general beginning, I thought, before the show, I kind of skimmed through some of the writings of Ingo Swann, one of the most famous psychics of our era. He recently passed away. And I noticed a couple of things that I thought would be worth discussing as an intro, because before you can do future viewing, you have to discuss what is viewing, right? The future is harder because I think we have free will, or maybe the future isn't set in stone yet. But if you think about it a bit, you can see that it's really hard to describe what you don't understand. And then even more so, you can't describe what you can't see. And this is an interesting topic, but I'll give you a couple of examples from Ingo. So when they were developing the remote viewing program at Stanford Research, they had test people there. And one of them was Hella Hammett, a famous photographer. And they gave her a target of a nuclear power plant. And all she could see was a tea kettle boiling water. Well, of course, that's wrong. That's totally wrong. She didn't get it at all, right? But Ingo asked her, do you have any idea what goes on in a nuclear power plant? And really, she had no idea. So the two of them went over what is inside a nuclear power plant. And then there's that famous quote from Einstein that it's a hell of a way to boil water, right? And anyway, she got a different nuclear power plant as a target later, and she nailed it. She just said, well, it's one of those things that's a nuclear plant, right? So she went from a tea kettle boiling water to knowing the details with the same target, essentially. And that's because now, inside her mind, she had an idea of what these things were. And that's a limitation we all face. So keep in mind, when you read Nostradamus talking about something, they didn't have skyscrapers, they didn't have jets, they didn't have steamships. How can you describe what you've never seen? It's very hard. And then one other story that I thought is even more interesting is kind of hushed up by the scientific establishment, but when Darwin traveled around, he went to Patagonia, and they were on a big enough boat, and they parked out in the bay, docked out there, and they came on shore. And this is in Darwin's notes, by the way, in his diary. The locals couldn't see the boat. That's right. You may have heard this story before. They actually couldn't see it because it was too big of a boat. They couldn't imagine that there were such things. And this was not a failure of what shall we say, eyesight. It was a mental failure. They couldn't see the boat. And eventually, they got to talk to the shaman for that tribe. And he could see it, and then gradually could explain things in such a way that eventually the tribe became able to see it. Now, I think this is fascinating because it wasn't within their reality box. It wasn't within their world, and so they just plain couldn't see it, even though it was basically right in front of them. So that's kind of a problem with viewing things. And future viewing is even more so. And it also is interesting that it's the shaman who could see it because his reality box was a lot bigger. So I think we need to keep that in mind when we, particularly with older people, but more than 100 years ago or something, they just didn't have the same kind of world we do. So it makes it much, much harder to see these things. So first I'd ask, have any of you heard that story, the Darwin story?
No, I have not.
No, I
Melody,
don't
had
think
you heard?
so. I've heard similar stories, but not about Darwin. Stories of particularly shamans or tribal medicine people being the only one that could understand sort of what understand that the camera was taking a picture, or that when taken to New York City, and asked what they felt about it, they said, oh, well, I've seen this in visions before, but I wasn't aware. But, and the other one I would be aware of also was a story my professor told me that happened to a friend of his, where he was working with the pygmies before they were brought onto the reservations. And he was talking to a pygmy chieftain, and they were walking, and he said, let me take you on it. Would you like to go in my van? And they said yes, and they found a road, and the road was kind of different, but that was okay. But they went to the top of a mountain, and the pygmy chieftain had only lived in the forest and in the jungle. He'd never been on top of a mountain. And he said, what are all those little people in houses? That must be a different world. And he had no sense of perspective. He could not see, and he could not understand that these were big people. He was so high up that they looked small. But I was not familiar with the Darwin story, no.
Well, that story, in my opinion, is covered up, essentially. You hear it apocryphal, in an apocryphal way. They talk about it, and they just make it sound like it's this urban legend. But it's not. It's in Darwin's diaries. And the mainstream scientists today don't want you to think that a shaman could see what the people couldn't. And I think this is an important example. And of course, Darwin is so important in the mainstream scientific paradigm of our day that it's doubly damaging for them, so they essentially cover it up. But yeah, that's where that story comes from. But it probably happened to other explorers in different locations as well, because it seems to be, as your example with the not seeing the people or understanding the people from on high, it seems to be basically a human limitation, that we have a great deal of difficulty seeing something when it isn't in our world, essentially. If you've never seen a boat bigger than 10 feet long, then a 300-foot boat can't exist, right? It's that simple. So I think this is fascinating, because before we can even get into the future, how can we see the future? If you can't see a big boat right in front of you, how do you hope to see something 200 years from now somewhere? And I think this also segues into the idea that if you do want to, I guess you would say, practice some of these things, like let's say remote viewing, it is very, very, very beneficial to do certain kinds of exercises to try to broaden your mind. So that would include sketching. It would include trying to improve your vocabulary dramatically. And even technical things. And technical doesn't necessarily mean nuclear power plants. It can mean, let's say, learning about knitting, right? The kind, different fibers, things like that. The more you know, the more your mind can latch onto and see. And that.
And you just realized you did two things at once, because I'm knitting.
Yes.
We're talking about it, and I'm knitting. I just had to throw that in.
Well, and there is that other aspect, that there are these waves within waves and such, but we won't get into that. But anyway, I think this is important to understand, is that people have this idea that you sit down and you see the future, and then some people have vision, some people essentially, use a crystal ball, some people use different things, but you can't see what you can't see, right? These Indians couldn't see a big boat. And we too have our limitations. And you certainly have trouble if it's something you haven't run across. If you've never worked with fibers, it's hard to relate to fibers. So that's one of, I bring this up because there are a lot of critics who say, Nostradamus didn't get this, that, or the other right. Or I think you've got to be realistic. You can't see something that's not in your frame of mind, right? If, let's say 60 years ago, the greatest psychic on earth had been asked to describe the events of 9/11, what do you think he would have come up with? Any idea, Herm? So, in other words, the point is that the Twin Towers didn't exist.
That's right.
Right?
If you look at some of the Nostradamus works, I mean, he talks about, he describes almost like a pig man or something, and it seems to be describing a pilot with like the goggles and the mask on, so I know where you're coming from for sure.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is think about the ideas that happened on 9/11 or the aftermath of that, and then think to, let's say, your grandparents or something, talking to them about this. There were no Twin Towers. Islamic terrorism was really something they couldn't grasp. I mean, what could that have meant? Even the word terrorism would have been a bit of a stretch for them, right? I mean, you had the Valentine's Day massacre or something, right? So terrorism is when the mafia shoot people, right? It wouldn't have been in their world. And the idea that from that, you'll have these huge skyscrapers collapse, however many, 3, 4, whatever, more than 2. And then you're going to go have a bunch of wars based on it. And you're going to fight a technique, of course, as we all know. You're going to fight, like left hooks or something like that. You're going to fight terrorism. This would have been really something beyond their ken. I don't think there's any chance they could have understood this whole idea.
I think, though, that you're jumping the gun a little bit, though, because I think 60 years ago, which would have been 1940s, 1950s, somewhere in there. Mm-hmm. I'm barely bad at math. I think that people could actually, I think a psychic or someone like, say, Edgar Cayce, who died right before the end of World War II, I think he did not predict 9/11, but I think he could have, to some degree, understood what he was seeing because people had airplanes. People could certainly have understood a plane falling into a tower, and they knew what skyscrapers were. They didn't necessarily know what the Twin Towers were, but I think that a psychic seeing that, particularly like, say, during World War II or just after, would have been more likely to think it was an enemy attack, which in some ways, depending on, it definitely was an enemy of some sort, but I mean, you would think it would be a country. And you would, because it was an act of war. But if you went back 100 years previous to that, or even 200 years, I think then you would have, if you get before flight, I think I had to look it up, and I think balloons were first used in warfare in the late 18th century. So especially if you get before the 18th century, and to some degree even 100 years after, I think you're absolutely correct. But I think 60 years ago, I think a psychic could have understood it. They wouldn't have, they would have likely misinterpreted some of the details, particularly if they weren't just a direct channel of some sort. If they saw a dream or a vision and were trying to analyze it and write it down, I think they would probably think that it was whatever the current enemy of the day was, or might be, and that there had been an attack, like a bomber or something, or a terrible accident. But I think they could have understood it.
Well, I think it's a question of degree. I mean, they could have understood it to a degree, but the point was not simply the idea of a skyscraper. The point was that the Twin Towers didn't exist. Those became the emblems of modern capitalism, American-style, financier-driven capitalism in the world, mm-hmm. So that they represented America's power to the world. And they weren't built yet in the 50s, right? The late 60s, early 70s or so. And so the idea of a skyscraper, for sure. The idea of a plane, for sure. But my point was they represented to the world American capitalism, right? They were named David and Nelson, the two Rockefeller brothers, right? It was the peak of America that they represented. And that's why they were such a target in many ways. But yeah, sure. Technically speaking, I can see where you're coming from, and I agree with you. But I was just trying to point out that the symbolic meaning of it would have had no. Why would you be targeting them as opposed to somewhere else, right?
I think they're right. I think that would be very confusing to somebody trying to see it even 60 years ago. You're right.
So now when we go back to periods earlier than that, let's say Nostradamus or something, well, as you can see, it's going to be an incredible challenge because they didn't have planes, they didn't have balloons, they didn't have skyscrapers, and even the ability to go to war with somebody halfway on the other side of the war would have been impossible, right? So you couldn't even, it wouldn't be in your reality box, so to speak. So it would have been a great, great challenge to really expect somebody like Nostradamus to put anything close to the modern context in something, even if he basically nailed the target, so to speak.
Yeah, I actually just dug up that quatrain plane. It was Century 164. And it says, they will think they have seen the sun at night when they will see the pig half-man. Noise, song, battle, fighting in the sky perceived. And one will hear brute beasts talking. So a lot of people interpret that as being air combat with the mask on and the goggles.
Right, but you can see how others would have grave doubts about that.
Oh, yeah. No, I agree.
Because, I mean, it's so difficult. And so I think that's what we're looking at. When we discuss future viewing, we have all these limitations. And I think this is just a tough target to come to grips with. I mean, in addition to that, you have all the other things like personal issues, right? Like I know in remote viewing that if something is basically boring to your subconscious, it's very, very hard to keep at it. One of the reasons, like targets for gambling or the stock market tend to disappoint is because people get very, very bored with it. You know, it's much an interesting target is much more keeps you in the game, so to speak.
Isn't it hard to see numbers and letters when you're remote viewing as well, playing?
Well, yes, those are the real tough ones, because those are human abstract kind of creations. In a sense, they don't, I don't know if you say they don't exist, but they really are a construct, right? I mean, some letter, it's different in different languages. I mean, you know, look at English. I mean, a lot of the times the words you don't even pronounce the way they're spelled, right?
Yeah, true.
Right? Well, anybody learning English as a second language can
tell me about it.
Can talk about the problems of spelling and pronunciation, but I'm saying it's a total construct. It's just something that's there, and so as a target, okay, Oolong. Here's another thing. Here's another tough target, and actually almost impossible target, and that's a painting.
Why would that be?
Because it's not a real thing. It's somebody else's idea of something.
So if you honed in on a painting, would you just perceive whatever that painting depicts and assume it's real?
Well, different people will have different results, but typically you'll have a lot of problems because it's not. You know, a lot of these psychic things are kind of like getting a 1-second glance at something, right? Somebody has a vision, and you might think they get like 10 seconds to see everything. No, it's more like they get 1 second to see it and then 9 seconds to try to recover from that vision. And, you know, imagine you got to look at some big room you've never been in before, like some rich person's mansion, and you got 1 second to look at the whole thing. And now you come out and say, describe it. What did you see?
Yeah,
right?
You might only pick up one or two things.
Well, I think you're going to get the ambiance of the place. You're going to get a lot of it, right? Because your mind is superly powerful. But on the other hand, you're going to have trouble. And think about so many drawings. Is it clear? So many paintings. Is it clear what they are? Right? Anyway, I'm just going to say that's another tough thing because it's a human created construct, I guess is what I'm trying to say, right? I mean, Picasso, I mean, I look at a Picasso and I'm like, not remote viewing, and I don't know what it means, right? Right.
Yeah, I would think the impressionistic artwork would be even tougher still, right?
Well, anyway, you get the idea.
Yeah,
but for
yeah.
sure, numbers and letters are a big problem in, let's say, mathematical formulae or something like that. Herm, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is when you were describing the letters and numbers, and that's one of the triggers I use to wake up in a lucid dream, is if I'm looking at a digital clock and it looks like Klingon, that I've trained myself like, oh, gee, I must be dreaming. Little things like that, and it's exactly like you described. The same thing with letters. I mean, they look like Klingon, and if you've seen it a few times, and you can use that to wake up within that context. But getting back to the painting, I'd just like to bring up an idea that images like that tie one as an observer to the author of the images in very interesting ways. In other words, when an artist makes that two-dimensional or three-dimensional artifact, they've put their observer self, they've transferred part of their observer self into it, and anyone who then observes it becomes tied into it. And I guess a question I've always had is whether those connections of looking at it are so powerful that when they occur in our regular time and our regular waking time, don't occur during a remote viewing, and that may be the problem, that you can't establish, for lack of a better word, these observer connections with that object, because it's not, those connections can't be made in that particular reality, but they can only be made in this waking reality. And I mean, it's just something I've noticed as well with art, with trying to come back with pictures of artifacts, from, say, a lucid dream, which is very different from remote viewing in some ways, is that you get a real sense that you're tapping into something that the artist has seen and put out there, and every time someone looks at it, they're connecting with that whole connected field that artifact represents, and that doesn't occur in those other, for lack of a better word, realities. I don't know. Just
Well, that's a long topic. It's discussed a lot these days. Entanglement.
Right. That's the word I was looking for. Is that entanglement? We entangle. I mean, the feeling I get, and it's just an intuitive thing, is that we can entangle with an artifact here because we can see it, touch it, feel it, smell it, etc. But that entanglement is somehow very important. It does change. It changes the course of the future, becoming entangled with that artifact, at least for you, But that entanglement is prevented in those other planes, I guess I would say.
Yeah, well, there's no question that if you have an object that's been in physical contact with somebody a long time, that it's easy to get information from it, relatively speaking, right?
Right.
If the owner of it has an accident or something like that, you can get it from that person's whatever necklace or something, right? This is pretty routine, and it works a lot better if somebody has worn that necklace a long time, because the entanglement is so strong that essentially, however you want to call it, the paths in the matrix get worn down to the point where, they're pretty easy for others to follow, I guess is what I would say.
Right, they sort of get grooved, but yeah, I understand. But
yeah, so I think it's a very interesting topic. Dean Radin has written on this and given many speeches that you can find on the internet discussing the whole idea of entanglement and where can we, test it, where can, that kind of thing. But it's in a sense a newer field, right? It's not as obvious as, let's say, remote viewing.
I noticed
but
too
over time we're going to get there. Yeah, go ahead, Herm.
I noticed too that we're using the terms remote viewing and future viewing, and for some reason I don't know, I don't know much about this particular field, but it seems like remote viewing would be a better term than future viewing, because it seems like when you're viewing, do you really have control? And I guess I should ask this as a question to both Plain and Melody. Do you, how much control do you have over the actual time? In other words, how do you know you're not viewing something in this that would be 60,000 years ago that, for all you know, could look exactly like, the World Trade Center thing happening, because something similar happened then? How?
Herm, that's a very good question. Okay, so I think now we can get into the topic of time. Melody, have you got any thoughts on time?
Yes, in fact, I can actually answer his question, at least from a personal viewpoint, and that is actually sometimes you can't. Is the answer, at least as as an intuitive psychic, as sort of a person who occasionally, what my Native American elder friend called a dreamer, somebody who dreams things that are very powerful, sometimes that obviously do come true, sometimes that seem to be symbolic and come true, and other times it's just hard to know where they came from. I think sometimes you get clues. I've talked before, and I won't go into a lot of detail, but I was once doing a trance session with somebody on top of a ridge in San Francisco, and I saw a giant wave come through twice, and it was this monster serpent of waves that actually went into the Central Valley, and the only time clue I had on it was there were houses and people. So that's why I turned to my friend and I said, at least I know it wasn't 60,000 years ago, about what you just said, because there are people there. So, and their houses, their modern, and presumably this meant that, and it wasn't like probably not 5 million years in the future either. It was probably within a context. Other than that, I don't know. Other times, and another very good example very quickly that actually did happen was when I was first learning to do trance work. I was what's called scrying in a bowl. This is of water. This is a technique that Nostradamus also used. Not that I am in any way comparing myself to him, but it's the same technique. And it's actually written down in a book that of stuff that people were keeping for this group of somewhere. And what I saw was the city by the bay where the bridge has fallen and the harbor is burning. And I repeated this several times, and I could see it in the water, and I knew that it was San Francisco. And my friends actually, when the session was over, said, shall we call our friend in San Francisco? Should we warn them? And I said, well, I hesitate to do that because I think it's San Francisco. It looks like it could be, but am I seeing something that's going to happen next week, next year, 200 years from now? Presumably that bridge is going to be there. And of course, what actually happened, so we didn't call my friend. And what happened in reality was about 4 years later, I had moved to the Bay Area just in time to be in the middle of that earthquake. And I was actually sitting there in UN Plaza when the radio said, and the bridge has fallen and the harbor is burning.
Wow.
So now, and thankfully, though, the whole city was not just, and there's assumption. I assumed from the vision that things would be so horrible and, the whole city would be destroyed and the bridge would completely collapse, neither of which happened.
Here's one for you, though, Melanie. How do you know you didn't tap into a movie or something? How many movies have portrayed that same scene?
I don't completely, and that's also a good question, because one thing that came up when you were talking earlier is there's a very famous story. Unfortunately, I've only heard it second or third hand, but of a man that when he for years had this catastrophic dream of a planet exploding and assumed it was the end of the world being blown up until he went and saw Star Wars. And that's actually true. And he's written about this. I've seen it floating around, and unfortunately I don't have the reference. And he went, that was his vision. He had dreamed movie.
Wow. Okay, that's interesting.
And so, I can't say, but I do think that because it was my personal timeline, so to speak, I think that I really, and I was training to try to future view. And I think Plain can talk more about this, but I think the reason for using the different terms is because the remote viewing is a very specific thing with very specific protocols. And I think are we using the word future viewing or far seeing or any of those divination as sort of a way to keep it apart from remote viewing, or is that just sort of come up as a new term, the future viewing?
No, I used it just because I didn't want to use remote viewing.
Okay.
I wanted us to discuss a lot more than remote viewing.
Yeah, and remote. Oh, sorry.
Well, the thing with remote viewing is it's essentially a technique. Protocols were developed, and I think they have a lot of strengths, but I think they have some limitations too. And future viewing was just meant to say we're going to discuss a lot of different things: cards, runes, scrying, whatever, different things. That was the reason for the title I chose of future viewing. The other point in the future viewing is I wanted to make this show talk about not the past so much, because actually the present and the past are much easier in something like remote viewing than the future. And I think that I'm just much more familiar with people using things like cards or scrying or whatever when they're looking into the future. I don't even know as much about how well it works when looking into the past, where I think remote viewing is fairly strong in that sense. And since we're talking about time, I'll get into that. As far as remote viewing goes, you just use a move command, and it works quite well. You just say move to the present time or move to 10,000 BC. And that's it. You're there. It works quite well. It's quite controllable. That's one of the advantages of remote viewing. As a matter of fact, that was the whole purpose, really, because if you had the quality of psychics that they had, let's say at Stanford, people like Ingo Swann, you don't really need all these protocols, to be honest. They're so good, it's painful. But it makes it controllable. And one of the things it helps with is controlling time and location. And I think that certain other methods or certain other psychically talented people maybe don't have the same kind of quality of control when it comes to saying, okay, now move 100 meters to, the east or something like that. But we can go into that more. Melody, perhaps you can get into that a bit. When you want to control locations or times more precisely, do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, my experience with something like cards or something is it's really, you can ask questions, but I don't think it's quite as precise. Any
no,
feeling?
it's not as precise, and this is why I often think if one is working or a number of people are working on a big project to try to find out something, it can help to work with people from different disciplines, because what you can do with the cards or the runes, particularly the cards more than the runes, is you can try to set parameters, and basically the tighter you set them, I found the more likely you are to get a direct answer. You still don't always, but you can say, I want to read for today, or I want to know what's going to happen. What are the main things? Is something likely to happen before June 1st, type of thing, and specify the year, because sometimes if you forget that, it's not going to happen. With visionary work, dream work, time is extremely difficult unless you have some experience with directed dreaming, sometimes, or directed vision. You can tell yourself, you can actually try to look for a newspaper or something, but even then, you have to. Most of the time, I know that doesn't happen to me, because most of the time, when I'm having what I think of as a real or a power dream, I'm just there, and I don't even realize that I'm asleep. So, and until I wake up, sometimes with very great relief. But with cards, with runes are very archetypal. Runes are very ancient. They go back at least 2,000 years. They are a construct. Some of them come from the Latin alphabet. Some of them come from other things. But they were used at least as a magical system and probably a divinatory system for a very long time. They have a lot of symbology to them, so they're almost more like Freud, Jung's idea of like universal symbols of the unconscious or something. They're very difficult to pin down in time. Again, you can try it. You can say like, I'd like to know, should I move next year? And you'll probably get some indications on whether it's a good or a bad idea, but you would get probably a much sharper answer of some sort with the cards. But it's very difficult. Time is probably the hardest thing. I use a pendulum in my own work, and I'm not that great with it, and I tell my clients that, but I have found the pendulum to be the best way when someone says, will my boyfriend call me, how long will it be before they call me back? And if we've established the boyfriend is going to call them back, I can like go 1 month, 2 months, or 1 week, 2 weeks. And usually the pendulum is fairly accurate, but again, it's an iffy thing.
Well, I think when we're discussing the pendulum and some of these, we get into, I guess what you're going to say, the types of viewing, right? Because there are viewings that affect you as a person, right? Your love life, your financial situation, your health, right? And things like, where should I live, right? And I think it's common to run into certain problems with some of these things. I mean, I just my limited experience with something like pendulums is I think the results are better when it doesn't involve me. And I don't think I'm unique in this. I think some techniques of trying to divine things are better when you're doing it for somebody else. So that's one issue. Then we have this issue of controllability or time. So, if you're talking about, let's say, the future of a country, is there going to be a big war within the next year or something like that? Some things may work better. And then I think we also have to get into, what can I say? There are perhaps energies or things that one can study, like, let's say, astrology, where some of this, people would argue, are more influences as opposed to hard and fast rules. There's a time in the air, so to speak, when warlike energies are all around, or there's a time when creative influences are all around, right? And the people at the top know this, of course. I mean, there's that famous quote by one of America's most famous historical figures, J.P. Morgan, that millionaires don't use astrology, but billionaires do. And I think that sounds about right. And of course,
sorry.
I'm sorry, but $1 billion in the year 1900, of course, was worth a little bit more than it is today, right? I mean, so it's people with $100 billion today, right? But they lie to us and say that such people don't exist. Anyway, but you can see the influences. And skeptics would say that, well, the reason wars always start at astrologically warlike points is because the people who control governments are into the occult or into strange things, and so they want to do that. And I can't deny that that is probably a factor. But I think there's a little bit more to it. I mean, we all around us in society, if you've been around more than about 20, 25 years, you see that there are basically energies in certain periods of time, right? There's an energy of tension. There's an energy of creativity. There are these different energies. And astrology is certainly one of the, if not the most widely used means of trying to get an idea of what the future will have, right? Were you going to say something, Oolong?
Yeah, I was just going to say it's fairly well known that the Reagans actually used to sign a lot of the peace treaties and nuclear treaties, et cetera, on astrologically important dates, and I think they actually had an astrologer who worked for the administration.
Yeah, my understanding is that Nancy, at least, and possibly the Reagans, both of them, were consulting with an astrologer. And one of the things that I wanted to point out is that this reading of energies is actually basically what I try to do with the cards for the most part. And when I do my current event readings, that's exactly what I'm trying to do. Is most of the time, when I'm not seeing a concrete event, I'm seeing a situation which makes certain types of events more likely. And I have friends who are astrologers who will often say, talk about how close they are, which is why I think astrology may really be probably the most important of the alternative divination methods when it comes to trying to establish this sort of thing. The cards are really fun and interesting, and they worked for me because I'm very intuitive. But I think astrology, again, it's very exact and can really pinpoint these periods when it doesn't mean you will have a war, but when war is, say, very likely, or when, like you said, a great piece of literature is likely to suddenly spring out, or these sorts of. But the problem with astrology is, though, this is according to one of my friends now who is an astrologer, is you have to know, for example, a date to calculate from for say a nation, and when you or a situation, when did it start, and that can be the difficulty. So that's why it's not the only way of going about it.
Well, Melody, I've always had this kind of question for astrology fans or professionals, and that is, what date do you use for the U.S.? Is it the Declaration of Independence? Is it the ratification of the Constitution? Is it, Articles of Confederation? What do you consider the U.S. to be? Was it the publishing of Bacon's The New Atlantis?
I think I could ask, but I think the answer is that different people use different ones. There may be, for something as big as the U.S., a kind of accepted date, like possibly the signing of the Declaration of Independence. I don't know. But you're absolutely correct. That's the difficulty with doing current events in astrology, is when does something start? When is it born?
Well, I've asked different astrologer types this, and they do have some official party line now, but the fact is they don't all agree with it. But anyway, I think this is a serious matter, and I think, though, that what you're saying is very important, that there are energies, and that's what astrology and some of the cards and such are getting into, as opposed to exact events. Whereas if you see some vision, that's more of an event. And remote viewing, of course, is an attempt to kind of go to a certain place in time in the matrix and kind of gather a certain amount of information from it. By the way, speaking of astrology, Ingo Swann, there was another thing I liked about him. He was a persistent supporter of Virgo rights. For example, the New York, Psychical Research Society up there, they would have annual, the grand dame of it, they had like a birthday party for her, but it turned into a birthday party for people there. And since half of the members were Virgos, of course, it ended up being in Virgo, right? And then all the others got kind of disappointed about this, and they went off and created their own party. So they had like 2 parties, one for Virgos and one for non-Virgos. And this shows the why the world is so messed up. I mean, here Virgos have created a perfectly good workable system, and the rest conspire to mess it up, and so on and so forth. And so he was always pointing out that something like the ancient Greek democracy, randomly picking citizens and making them create laws or something, isn't going to work very well because you don't have enough Virgos in it, right? So anyway, of course, this is tongue-in-cheek, but that does raise another question, though, is that not just future events, but are there characteristics in people, right? And, are some people better suited to be whatever, generals, and other people are better suited to be musicians or something like that, based on when they were born and where they were born. And that's a long topic, but if you are discussing the future, you do have to consider that it could be different for different people based on those energies that impact them. And I'm certainly no expert. Some others like you, Melody, may be more knowledgeable about this. But I do think we have to keep that as another thought. that it's not just energies for, let's say, war or energies for America. It's also energies for Ireland or energies for the EU or energies for your family and how they play out.
Oh, certainly. I would totally agree with that. And when I actually read for clients, the majority of what I'm reading, and I tell them this, is the energy around that person, either for that time or on a certain topic for them. Or one of the things the runes do very well, actually, is what I call full life path readings, where because you sort of spread them out and you look to see what the energies were when the person was born and kind of where they are now and kind of what may be fated or at least likely to influence even the far future. But again, they tend to be more simple. Sometimes you get flashes of exact things, but more often it's influences. It's a person might have a rune for extreme creative expression, or for a life path that they work better with other people, with partnerships. But how the person chooses to put that into effect is really very much their own choice. And I think with astrology, again, I'm not an astrologer. I refer people to astrologers and I work with astrologers, but I think it's basically the same thing. The difference is an astrologer can look at the date of the signing of, again, Ireland. Modern Ireland, you have the same problem. Did it start in 1916 or did it start with the Constitution? Most people do from the East, like take from the Easter Rising, but there are different dates to try to read it. But they can sit down and do a chart for, say, modern Ireland. And look and see where the planets are and like compare that to the banking crisis, where I would be more likely if someone were to ask me what is going to happen with the what will be the most likely fallout from the Anglo tapes, which is a really big scandal right now, where here in Ireland, where a bank that failed and the taxpayers. One reason we're in such horrible financial straits is because the taxpayers were asked to essentially bail out this bank, and it's a big mess. But basically, there were tapes found with the people who were running the bank just making these outlandish statements and just totally saying everything you would expect any elite person to say in a comic book. It's that bad, and it just happened. And so someone might ask me, well, what's the most likely outcome of that? Well, my monkey mind or my regular mind would say, hopefully these guys will go to jail. But we don't know that. And I could do a spread on that. And I could look and see the most likely energies around it. It doesn't mean it's certain that it will happen that way. But I could probably get an indication of whether, well, maybe they are likely to wind up in jail. Or perhaps the country is likely to have a problem, or probably there wouldn't be a war, but you might have like economic warfare or something that resulted in directly or indirectly from this happening. So yeah, you can target things like that. But again, the more specific one is in what you look at the energies for, the more likely you are to get a real indication. If you try to read for Ireland and for the EU and for things, which is something of what I try to do in my blog, which is really more for fun than anything else, it can get very confusing because you sort of just have to try to figure out intuitively what the cards mean and where. And sometimes that works really well. And sometimes, in my experience, the cards are usually right, but I don't always get the right interpretation. And I think that's true of a lot of psychics.
Mm-hmm. Well, then there's another issue, and that is that the real world is awfully tricky, right? I mean, in China, they have a number of people who seem to have been convicted of corruption or whatever. But you look at the pictures of the people who are going to jail and you say they look nothing like the people who supposedly committed the crimes. And it's routinely discussed in China that you can pay somebody to do your time, so to speak, right? So if you steal whatever, $50 million, and you pay somebody $1,000 a year to serve your 5 years in prison, somehow it seems like you're coming out ahead. You can see the limitations. You can see the real world can be awfully tricky and complicated when we try to get into it. And if you just have some vision, some impressive person has some kind of vision, well, when they come out of that vision and then they want to write down what it was that they saw, you can see how it could be awfully difficult to use that information in the real world. And I know that from remote viewing, that it's very, very hard, even if you constantly go back and grab information, to put it all together at the end in the way that most normal people want to use it is a bit tricky, right? I mean, let's say you get the colors right. Well, so what? Right? You know, a policeman doesn't care. You lost your gold ring. You don't care about whether it's on a gold carpet or a red carpet. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? What matters is, in other words, the results, right? Is it actionable, I guess you might say. And that's the real challenge. Anyway, why don't we move on to some of the more famous seers in history, like Nostradamus or Casey, or I suggest people look into Van Rensburg a little bit, but there's not very much in English, unfortunately. So we'll start with Nostradamus. I mean, everybody has heard of Nostradamus, and he seems to have been really, really accurate with a lot of things in his basic day. And so accurate, in fact, that it was risky for him, and he perhaps, narrowly stayed out of jail or worse in his time. So I guess we could start there and say he was an incredibly successful guy. And Oolong, you might know, a lot of people talk and say that he was in a secret society and that they have some of these divining techniques or whatever. Have you looked into that?
I've looked into a couple different angles. I've heard some people argue that he was a secret agent for one of the European nobilities, and the prophecy that really brought him to the limelight was the one about the jousting match with the king, and the young lion will slay the old in a cage of gold, etc. He'll be in pain, and some people say that was pre-planned and that he actually was given that beforehand. However, I find that very dubious. But yeah, I've also heard, different tales about him being involved with secret societies, and I'm not exactly sure what the name of them would have been or if they'd be anyone that would still be around to this day. But yeah, I've also heard that he took nutmeg and various different drugs that would also help induce his visions.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a lot of talk about him, and it's hard to know what's really real at this point because it's he's a larger-than-life figure, right? There is also talk that essentially he was revealing stuff that you're not supposed to reveal to the masses, right? And I think when you also get back into these, what shall we say, more esoteric topics of that time, you get into the fact that they weren't writing in a way that normal people could understand. They used different techniques. They talk about the language of the birds, for example. And you should write everything in such a way that it makes sense in a mundane way. But to people who have either secret knowledge or are, I guess what you would say, familiar with allegories or other things, you could understand the true meaning. But it's a different meaning. And I've read that some say he was attacked in his time for revealing stuff that he wasn't supposed to reveal, and that his defense was that it's true he revealed stuff, but it wasn't usable for the people at the time. And I think that idea comes down to modern times. Now and then you hear it discussed that it's okay for secret society members to say something as long as they say it in a way that the public can't understand.
Well, it wasn't just the secret societies he had to worry about. There was also the Inquisition back then.
Yes, of course. And, you're playing with the de Medicis, right? You're playing with the, which in addition to being like the richest family around, they were also royalty. So you were talking about quite a power force to have to deal with. And if you talk about the death of these people, you can imagine how amazingly difficult and dangerous that would be. But Oolong, are you familiar? What techniques did he like to use? I mean, we know he liked nutmeg. We know, I think they say he liked scrying, right? I mean, crystal ball.
Yeah, he used a technique from an old, I think it was an old Greek writer called Iamblichus. And if you look in the quatrains, there's actually some of them that semi-describe the technique that he that he did use for his scrying. So we talk about him wetting the robes and saying various incantations, which point back to this book by Iamblichus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've read that, and then, we don't really know. I mean, push comes to shove, but it seems like he was using a crystal ball, right, as the main...
I think it was a bowl of water.
Oh, actually, you're right. I'm sorry. It was the bowl of water. You're right. It was the bowl of water was his main uh, technique. And what can we say? All we can do is look at the quatrains and say they're amazing and very, very interesting. Um, but when you start talking about something like, let's say, an eagle, right? What does an eagle mean? Does it mean the United States in the modern day, or did it mean, oh, I don't know, Russia under the czars, or you know what I mean? What does an eagle mean, right?
Right.
You can see the possibilities are quite dramatic. I mean, I'm not sure if it was Nostradamus or somebody else, but there's one in history that goes along the lines of, the eagle will essentially, I don't know if I'm going to say meet its match, but against the lion, right? The eagle will somehow come to a bad end versus a lion, right? And then in Arabic, Assad means lion, right? So you could argue then if the U.S. is the eagle, if the U.S. Loses the war in Syria and otherwise things go downhill from that point on, that, right, it was the eagle running into the lion and it was a disaster.
Yeah,
Now,
sometimes they only make sense in retrospect too. And
oh, absolutely.
I think the temptation is that anytime an event happens, people look to the quatrains and they try and make the quatrain fit the event.
Yes, and Melody, you're familiar with John Hogue, right?
Yes. Yes.
He's kind of like the world's expert on Nostradamus.
Yeah, he would be probably one of the best people to ask some of these things. But things that I have heard him say, or that I briefly discussed with him in emails and things, mostly just listening to him on interviews and reading his books, is that one of the things about Nostradamus is that to understand him, he used a great deal of 16th century astrology. So some of the things make a lot more sense if you are actually able to do not just regular astrology, but understand it from a 16th century perspective. The other thing to remember is that Nostradamus is a Frenchman, and he's a French patriot. He's living in Provence, and a huge number of his prophecies actually are about things that either involve France directly or indirectly. Even the speculation that his prophecy about the King of Terror coming from the sky was possibly a foretelling of 9/11. It actually starts with something about when trying to be contacted by the Normans, which would be the French. And apparently the French actually were trying to call the Americans on that morning and couldn't get through to warn them that there had been a possibility of a strike of some sort, of an action. So, but even in that one, if that's actually what Nostradamus is talking about in that quatrain, and John would be much more better to able to explain that than me on why he believes that it is, the first thing he brings up is the French connection, essentially. So, and John has mentioned, for example, Nostradamus is very popular in Japan, and a lot of people in Japan, of course, interpret things as being about Japan. But in John's opinion, very little that he's seen is. There's a few things that may be, but that wasn't really. And Nostradamus' focus wasn't really America either. I mean, there are things. It's mentioned several times. It was the continent of North America and South America were known by this point. They were being discovered, but they're only mentioned a couple of times. They're not really. If they are, it's very symbolically. There are prophecies that probably are about things that happened between America and Russia and the Middle East and things like that. But they're all from this French perspective. And there are other things that are kind of interesting about Nostradamus, and I don't want to go on too long, that John points out. But one of them is he doesn't think like a modern person, because he's not a modern person. And it's really a mistake to think he's a modern person. For example, he foresaw democracy. He also foresaw the French Revolution. And he thought democracy was a horrible idea. I mean, peasants deciding on their leaders? He was a monarchist. And he was, he was a protege, actually, of not a protege in the sense of being taught, but he was sort of a Merlin type of figure for Catherine de Medici. He was reading the horoscopes of her children, and their spouses, including Mary, Queen of Scots. So in his own lifetime, he was sort of being this almost Merlin-esque figure at court, which was very dangerous, as you pointed out. So he had to obscure a lot of things. He used a lot of anagrams. and he makes him very difficult for the modern person to understand, because not only is he not thinking like a modern person, but you can't just take an English translation and take it for what it says. You really have to understand medieval 16th century French, anagrams, Latin, Hebrew, and 16th century astrology. So it's very complex. And I'm not saying that John is probably one of the world's leading experts. I'm not saying he's right on everything, but I think he is. Sometime doing an interview with him might be a really interesting show.
Well, that's a possibility. I mean, clearly he's written a number of books, and he's spent endless hours studying the things that would be necessary to try to understand Nostradamus. But
there are a few other
us,
people that are doing it too.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
For us, though, I think one of the bigger things, though, is that when you make phrases like, land to the west, or, eagle, some of these things, it really depends. I mean, I think that in hindsight, you can say certain things, but until it actually happens, you just don't know. And that's kind of one of the limitations, I think, with some of these folks. Now, there are other seers, though, who I think were a little more precise. And then we get into the question, though, of how accurate were they? Like, let's say, Edgar Cayce. My interpretation, or my gut feeling all along, is that his medical side was very good. And that's probably a majority of what he did. I wouldn't know the numbers, but it might have been like 90% of the time that's what he was focusing on, is health for people. But when he's discussing the future, I mean, I forget now. I think in the next life he's going to be, on the ocean in Nebraska or something like that. I forget what it was, but some of those things don't seem to have come to pass. Some of the things that he was expecting, and maybe we're just not there yet. That's possible, but it's also possible that he wasn't really as accurate with it. And I don't know. Go ahead.
I also think that this is where we get into the hot button issue of time and timelines, or does the future change? Because when I was younger, I studied Cayce a great deal. I wished I'd had more time to brush up on things before the show. But basically a lot of the things that he predicted within his lifetime do seem to have been accurate. But the further out he gets, in my memory, the more things seem to be off, at least time-wise. As you say, they have not happened yet. And that doesn't mean they're not going to, but it does mean that in the cases where he gave exact dates, the further out you get from Cayce's actual death, the more off they seem to be getting. And I have wondered sometimes because I believe that people make choices and the future isn't totally fated, that there's some things that maybe are so big out there that they're really likely to happen, but particularly with human events or human caused events, I think that they can be delayed. A lot of his earth changes have not occurred according to the timing that he suggested, at least.
Right. And in the remote viewing world, we have a lot of sayings and allegories and things like that. And one of them is called a bug in the pond of time. And it's basically the idea that, let's say one bug or whatever, a frog, sees a bug on the other side of the river, or the pond in this case, and wants to swim over and get it. Well, that's great. You swim over there to go eat it. But the water, you create a movement in the water. By the time you get there, that bug may be gone. Now, the rock that the bug was standing on is still there, right? So some things move and some things don't in the future, because the future isn't really set. And I think that's basically the way it is. And I also think that another idea is like an hourglass with sand, that the closer you get to something, the fewer the possibilities. And the further out, the more the possibilities, right? I mean, what can I say? In a modern context, tomorrow, President Obama can't announce that he's going to move the White House to Denver, Colorado. Not really, because the preparations haven't been done, right? I mean, certain things have to fall in line to have other results in the real world. And the further out you go, the more chances you have of things occurring. And so Casey may have been seeing things, but, well, what can you say? As you said, he was more accurate the closer you got to the present time. And there's another guy that I find interesting named Van Rensburg, who was an Afrikaner 100 years ago, give or take, who had a tremendous track record of things in his time, and then even after his time, dealing with the events in South Africa and various other parts of the world. But very little of it is in English. And he just had these all-encompassing visions, I guess you would say. They would overcome him, right? And then he'd have his wife write them down or whatever. And some of them were quite famous. I mean, you know, a famous politician getting shot down, that kind of thing. So he ended up being able to hang out with certain fairly powerful people eventually. And that's another issue. There are some who, I guess you would say, unintentionally have visions. And sometimes those visions can be quite accurate. Now, unfortunately, I think a lot of them get forced into a paradigm, like typically a Christian paradigm, but other paradigms where people really, really want to have it mean something. And then they start promoting it sometimes after the person is dead. And that's a limitation. But I think we can't rule out that some of these in the past may have had very good ones. For what it's worth, Van Rensburg had a vision that Japan would be wiped out with earthquakes. Now, in his world, Japan had no relation. It had no relevance for his life, right? I mean, 90 years ago, living in South Africa, all the issues they faced, Japan was basically totally irrelevant. But that was one that he had, and that may or may not come to pass.
That's very interesting because Casey said basically the same thing.
Yeah, and then now we get into that other question: are there these vibes in the Akashic records, in the matrix, I guess you might say, that float out there, and they may be correct and they may be incorrect? I've talked to people who are fairly, what shall we say, well-known in the remote viewing world about the question of, let's say, remote viewing the Kennedy assassination. So many people have done that. There's so much psychic energy in the Kennedy assassination that I'm not sure that you can separate reality from what people think they saw, right? I mean, for one thing, just take as an example, let's say that, for the sake of the argument, that the Zapruder film was manipulated, right? Well, half the world has seen that film countless times. It's in their mind, right? For some of us, it's like you saw it from a fairly early age, right? I mean, you're, 10 years old when it happened, kind of thing. So maybe the Matrix can have things in it that are not necessarily real. Maybe they can be essentially worn down in a certain pattern, and then others will come and see it, and they'll see this incorrect pattern. So there are a lot of challenges when you get into this. I mean, it's not remotely simple. Anybody else? Oolong or Herm, you got anything to say on Casey?
I know one of the things I've heard about Casey is that people used to go in there and they'd sneak in and they would try to get stock tips and, various other pieces of information for monetary gain. And a lot of what they got out of him happened to be very profitable and very accurate. However, he would suffer physiological side effects from doing that, and I guess it really bothered him. So he tried to use his gifts, for mankind as a whole, rather than to try and let people profit from him. But apparently his accuracy, and again, in those, they would have probably been, stock market picks a week or two out, I'm sure, but he was quite accurate in those, apparently.
Herm?
This isn't about Casey, but one of the questions that came up was that we've sort of been discussing are the excuse me, problems or issues with remote viewing. And I guess for listeners out there, what can you take into account when choosing, say, a remote viewer, or what what has been found increases the chance of success? What factors are important when making, for example, when making the choice of assembling a bunch of remote viewers for a particular project? Are there, are there any benchmarks or portfolios they sort of carry around? And well, I'll leave it at that. I mean, it sounds like you have some experience with perhaps choosing, a remote viewer. I mean, what would you look for?
Well, I mean, first of all, the question is, what are you trying to achieve, right? And what is your budget? Because
okay, fair enough.
Well, no, it's in the real world, because if you want to elaborate, let's say, I don't know. Let's say you have the money, right, that you want to develop some piece of land. You want to put 50 houses on this huge area in Utah or something, and you want to know where to drill wells, right, or something. If you have some money on the line, now you may be willing to spend thousands of dollars on this project. But if you only have $100, that's a totally different question. So it really depends on what it is you're trying to do. But as far as evaluating people, I mean, it's known in the world, and you can find the companies that do it or the instructors who teach it. They will talk about the strengths and weaknesses of different people. They will have some semblance of records, like they'll have the information in a database, or they'll have something, because different people have different strengths and weaknesses. Some, for example, might be really good with sounds. Some might be really good with colors.
Okay.
Right? And, there was one fairly famous guy who was like anything nuclear, he would nail. He would get all the great details, right? So if you knew you were dealing with something nuclear, the easiest, most logical thing to do would be to get him. I mean, he's like always right in great detail, right? So that's, I guess what I'm trying to say is you would have to know the specifics of what you're looking for, because people have strengths and weaknesses in the field. And anybody can be wrong. I mean, that's another thing. It's not a perfect science. I mean, mistakes happen. But the one bit of advice I would give anybody, though, is it is very common to have poorly worded questions. And this can waste everyone's time and money. The more specific, the better. And if you start saying, if this, but what about that, and then if this, now we're getting way too many variables here, right? Where should I live? If I stay at the same job, and if my wife likes that town, and you know what I mean. Now you're making an unreasonable request for someone to figure out. You need to narrow things down, and also don't ask essentially impossible questions, or questions where that if you achieve what you want to do, it will make the remote viewer incorrect. In other words, don't mess with the future. And an example of that is very simple. If you're a policeman and you say, where will so-and-so be, the suspect, at 9 p.m. tonight, right? And you get an answer, he'll be at this bar. And then at 8:55, he gets arrested. Well, then he won't be at the bar at 9 p.m. He'll be on the way to jail, right? You'll have totally ruined the time loop. Now, that's another topic we could get into in a future show, is the question of time loops, along with things like entanglement, other complicated things. But you don't want to do that, because your subconscious, the remote viewer's subconscious, will be very unhappy about that. He was tricked, you see. You tricked him. You told him what was going to happen at 9. He gave you the answer, and then you violated your contract by going and arresting the guy, essentially. No, the thing is, you can simply phrase it differently, right? You don't have to say, where will he be at 9 p.m., right? I mean, you can, right? say, where will he be at 8:50, and then arrest him at 8:55 or whatever. You know what I mean? You have other options, is what I'm trying to say. But if you have a lot of money, this works. And you don't get answers, though. I mean, Joe McMoneagle, the famous remote viewer number 001 in the program from the government military stuff, he said he does all kinds of oil work. And he never knows if he's doing a good job, but, every 2 or 3 months, another check for tens of thousands of dollars comes in. So, right? Presumably he's doing what they want.
Right.
By the way, speaking of this issue of seeing things just in general, not just the future, it's probably worth pointing out. Earlier in this show, we kind of went a little bit into you can't see what you don't understand, right? But Joe McMoneagle gives an interesting point, and that is his view is that if let's say there are UFOs that are not from the underground military, secret space program, right? Let's say they're actually from somewhere far away. If, for the sake of the argument, if they have good psychic abilities, they may be able to distract us when we want to go look at them. They may be able to psychically prevent us from seeing what they're up to. And this is not such a radical idea. Many speculate that in past times on Earth, we had a more advanced civilization when it comes to psychic powers. And I believe that's the case. I believe that reading the literature, like the ancient Indian literature, you get that idea. And I don't think they were making this up whole cloth. I think this was the truth. So if another civilization came here, and it might even just be our cousins, right? They might be in a nearby star system or something. If they have more powerful psychic abilities than we have, they could recognize our looking at them and distract us. And Joe McMoneagle is arguing that they have the ability, he thinks, to essentially put a rattle for babies, something to distract babies.
Is that called psychic masking, Blaine?
Well, that's a related thing. Yeah, that you could put something that that's an attractor, and that essentially this is a limitation. In other words, let's say you find a very good picture of a UFO, and you give it to a psychic or a remote viewer, and they look at it, right? Through different techniques. Maybe they don't even see the picture. Maybe they do see the picture, whatever. But the answer is, all I see is a bunch of ice cream, right? Well, you're going to say, oh my God, that's like they're totally off. They didn't see the target, right? Perhaps, but perhaps the whoever's in charge of that craft has the psychic ability to make it so that anyone looking at them essentially is deflected to what they liked when they were children. And you, the viewer, liked ice cream a lot when you were a kid, right? Now you laugh, but there's actually a fair bit of evidence for this in different cases. And, I mean, you get into the whole question of aliens and other civilizations, but this is another thing to add to your list of, mightn't there be, I mean, even on Earth, there may be people who are psychically far more powerful than you and I are. And if they are, I think it's a fair bet that they would use that power. And they might even use it in a way that guarantees that they become rich and powerful. But I mean, this is all speculation, but we're talking about a bunch of variables. And it's really hard. But oh, by the way, I forgot to get into one thing I wanted to ask. Maybe Melody, you might have an idea. Have you got any thoughts on numerology? Have you spent any time looking into that?
I have only listened to, I can't remember her name now, but Glennis something or other on Coast to Coast. And I think that she's called herself the Numbers Lady. She's very interesting. I I have a theory. I think that you can make just about anything work in terms of divination if it works for you, and numerology seems to work for her. And it does seem to be a system that there does seem to be something to it. On the other hand, it is working with, as you say, a man-made construct, but then so are runes. But I think it does have some value. I think it's like astrology, but I'm not quite sure why it works. I really haven't worked with it myself much.
Well, I've only looked at it a little bit. That famous, what was his name, Chiro, the famous.
Chiro, yeah.
And it looks interesting. And I guess what I'm saying is numerology and some related things, I guess you would say they get into kind of the structure of matter or the structure of thought. And it's interesting, like kymatics, if you know what that is, the sound creating signs, emblems, and things.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Some of the Egyptian hieroglyphs, if you put like sand on a tile and you play different notes, they will form those patterns. And there may be fundamental properties in things based on sound or light or, I don't know, ripples in water. I'm not really sure, but numbers may be one of them. And certainly, Oolong, some of the darker secret societies seem to be interested in the properties of things, like numbers. I think Crowley was of the view, the number 11 is our team and 7 is the perfect number, so 77 would be the perfect number for our team, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, and I know a lot of the Jewish Kabbalists have numerical systems such as gematria, which they use for prophecy and, to come up with magical formulas. Basically, I think in the Hebrew alphabet, each letter is also the equivalent of a number. And what they do is they can take certain words out of the Torah, and then they can substitute other words with the same numerical value to come up with, prophecies or different magical formulas. And that can be used for good or ill,
Yes, of course. But as usual, it seems like the darker side folks seem more intent on practicing or studying some of this stuff.
Yeah.
Right? Yes, well, so we have this other side, besides, cards and runes and things, I think, where you have these, like you're saying, some of it's from the Kabbalah, and the Hebrew letters, I think, just work with numbers well or something. I'm not quite sure about that, but that seems to be one of the reasons for the attraction to that. Plus, of course, you've got the Old Testament, right? So that's of value to people. But this is another thing that there may be properties that, Herm, you were talking about entanglement, right? There may be entanglements with things that we can't quite relate to. And so, for example, astrology may be based on that, right? I mean, it's very hard to explain this scientifically, right? But there may be entanglements based on where you're born or when you were born or how many letters are in your name, that kind of thing. And just, how can we say, intuitively, it seems to me that there are some connections with things like names and letters and whatever. There definitely seems to be something there. And I haven't studied it to the degree it would require to, go into a long talk about it, but I do think you can see it, and we ought to think about it a little bit. Clearly, then there are some, there's some things like the Kabbalah that can be used. I mean, there are certain, let's say, more questionable or things that even get into outright black magic, right? Where you may be able to see the future. I mean, possibly you can just call a certain demon for all I know, right? I don't know, but...
Yeah, well, apparently, if you look at the Book of Enoch, it discusses how, the original Watchers came down and taught the sons and daughters of man how to practice some of these arts. So there is sort of an otherworldly quality to a lot of it.
Yeah, it certainly feels that way. And personally, I just want to be careful, and I don't want to get too close to demons, right? Because I'm not sure that once you get them close, I'm not sure they leave. I look at certain political figures, and I think that the demons never left or something like that. So let's see. Now, what else did I want to go into here with the numerology? Melody, do you have any familiarity with the Kabbalah? Have you looked into that much?
Not really. I took one class with a friend, but the real expert on that would be my husband, who actually, before he got involved with the Norse, was trained as a Norse Germanic traditions, was trained as a ritual magician, and he actually took some classes in Hebrew in order to read the Kabbalah and able to read some of the literature. So most of what I know is just he'll mention something, or he'll talk about traditional tarot uses the Kabbalah and the numerology on it in this way or something like that, but it's very secondhand.
Mm-hmm. Well, the problem for me is certain topics from the past, like let's say alchemy, they're very hard to approach because essentially the writing is intentionally done in such a way that you can't understand exactly what is important and what is unimportant. And I think you have to, in other words, something like the Kabbalah, I think you have to spend a long, long time looking at it to really get a feeling for it. And I'm certain of that with alchemy, which I have more knowledge of, that some of these topics require long, long, long study. There is no, quick course, right? There is no real alchemy 101. And that's kind of the limitation. Now, maybe with some things it's a little easier, like numerology, maybe you can jump right in. But even with astrology, I think it's a long, long effort. So anyway, going back to some of the seers or people with vision, I don't know if others have any thoughts on Casey, but when I went over a lot of his stuff, I wanted to know more about the health, because why did he do such a great job with the health analyses and the suggestions? There are, there's a place that sells his health remedies. There's a long list of them. I think it's called Bar.
Yeah, I use his atomic iodine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's one of the ones he recommended a lot.
And I've used some of the products that he recommended over the years, and I found them to be pretty good. And so it's just kind of interesting that he had such an excellent result with that. And you kind of wonder if it could be copied today, or if there is somebody doing it and we just don't know about it. I don't know if any of you have any thoughts on that. Herm, have you any familiarity with Casey's medical side?
I don't actually have any, but I would. I don't know. Oolong mentioned the iodine, and I think there's definitely something there. I mean, at least for people that don't have adequate sources of it. I think probably 95% of the population isn't getting the amount of iodine that they evolved, that the species evolved with. So, but that's about all I could say. I don't know how he was using it. So.
There's a young Russian girl. Well, she's probably not young anymore. She's probably, I would guess, around 18 or 20 or thereabouts. And she's known as a girl with the X-ray eyes. And her ability was she could look at people and she could diagnose illnesses. To the point where she had drawn, various cellular deformities, and what the doctors told her is that she should forget about that ability and she should just focus on becoming a doctor or something. But there's lots of people out there that have, various skills to one degree or another aside from Casey.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've seen a video on the, like a YouTube kind of internet video of different people who've been trained in essentially, shall we say, seeing without having their eyes open, right? Constantly doing things with your eyes, behind a bandana or something like that, skating, whatever, different things, to where you can learn to do it without having your eyes open. And in my younger days, I practiced Aikido, and there's no question that the experienced people, the sensei, could really basically break the laws of physics every day in many, many ways.
Yeah.
There's no question about it in my mind. You could see it. I mean, if you see a guy who's 60 years old and weighs 105 pounds, and he's sitting down, and 4 linebacker types, college students, push him so his back is 1 inch off the mat, and then he sits up, and they can't stop him. That kind of thing, right? I could go on and on with the list of things. So there are these human superpowers that are clear. Well, anyway, getting back to the topic of future viewing, I guess, Melody, I thought I would ask if you wanted to give us any thoughts on what you're most familiar with, which was cards, in terms of, let's say, cards and runes. Let's say you wanted to get an idea for something. How would you approach it? Would you do many readings? Let's say, for example, for the sake of the argument, so many people are concerned about the economy, or at least their economy, right? Their situation, right? Financially speaking. And this could be ruined by war or other things, but let's say that that's an obvious problem. And going forward, how would you approach that? Would you recommend a series of readings, right, so that you discuss your personal situation in the next few months? How would you, when somebody comes to you, how do you deal with that?
Well, I actually had that happen a couple of times today. Even the economy and economic situation is a very common reason why people come to me. And the first thing I try to do is I will talk a little with the client. I'll explain to them that I'm an intuitive reader, and I'm not trying to get them to give me answers. This is not a cold reading, but that to some degree, the more information I have about what exactly we're asking about, the more likely we are to get a direct answer. And for example, someone I was reading for a couple of days ago, the issue wasn't just a job, but it was also involved a possible move. So we needed to look at all of the aspects, which involved looking, at the move itself, because it was to another continent. Then what were the job prospects? Would there be a job waiting there? Would there likely to be a period of unemployment even there? All of these things, we break them down into individual questions, and we look at them. If a person just comes to me and says, I'm unemployed, does it look like I'm going to have a job? We look at, we probably put a time on it. We look at say, what is the most likely, first of all, I'll just kind of give you a general reading around it. And if it looks kind of confusing, especially, or if it looks like yes, but we're not sure when, then we start doing things like whether there will be a job in the next 6 months, that sort of thing. Another very common sort of reading is when a person actually might have 2 job offers or 2 choices. Should they, and often this is again mixed up with, should I stay here where I am and take this job, or should I move somewhere else and take that job? And again, we really have 4 questions. So we break it down and look at each one. But a good way of doing it when you have an either or situation is I just will tell them, think about taking this job, but don't tell me which one it is. We have 2 possible jobs. You think about one or the other. You know which one it is. I don't. I lay down the cards and we read for that one. What's the most likely outcome of that job? And then we do the same thing for the other one. And then after I've read both of them, this way I cannot have any input in it. I can't have an opinion. I'm just reading what the cards say. Suggest, then the person tells me which it is, and usually there's really very obviously something that's a really good idea and something that's a really bad idea. Not always. Occasionally you get kind of the universe saying, it's kind of up to you, Jack, I don't care. But mostly you'll get one that's very positive and one that isn't. But the biggest hurdle in doing economic readings is this problem of very often it's not just the job, it's the home and the family and the place they live. And well, the thing everybody's dealing with these days is when you have an economic difficulty, a a lot of other things then become very difficult as well, and including like maybe losing their home or this kind of stuff. And we have to break it down to get really clear information.
Yeah, well, I think that's part of the problem is it's really a whole package of things that matter to people when they're trying to see how it applies to themselves. And in a certain sense, it's probably easier to look at something like, I don't know, let's say some political thing, like, a war in the Middle East, the situation there, right? Sketch what Tahrir Square in Cairo will look like 6 months from now or something like that, right?
Yes.
Or how President Assad of Syria, what will his day be like, a year from now, right? Because from that we can draw some information. If Tahrir Square has absolutely 0 people in it on the weekend, that's kind of a bad sign, right? That's a really bad sign, because that means, like, if you go out, you get shot immediately or something, right? Because that place is always, it's like always full of huge numbers of people. And on the other hand, if you saw it and it had huge numbers of people like they recently had, that also means that the chaos and problems are continuing, right? And if you see the military flying over with helicopters, that kind of thing, that would presume that the chaos is continuing, right? And of course, President Assad's life, a year from now, if his day is he gets up and goes to the government office and whatever, then that implies that he's doing okay, more or less, that the system there is hanging in there, and so on and so forth. In other words, it means that they didn't lose the war. And that might give you some broader thing that you're actually looking for. Because I think, psychically speaking, some of these things like wars or economics or some of this is a bit, again, that idea of a human construct of sorts, right? A good economy, a bad economy, it really kind of depends on what your expectations are, right? I guess what I'm trying to say is, in Egypt right now, let's say 40% of the people are really poor. Okay, and let's say a year ago it was 30%, right? So it's gotten worse. But in the grander cosmic scheme of things, compared to a couple thousand years ago, maybe it's paradise. Everybody has enough food almost, right? So it's a bit difficult to, phrase things in such a way that you get all the information you want about the future. Because your mind doesn't latch on to what kind of political settlement to a war, what that means. It really doesn't mean anything to you and me subconsciously, at least as I see it. And so in remote viewing, that's what is commonly done, is you try to get some results that you can later interpret, right? Like I said, how is the leader of a country doing a year from now or something like that? Because it's difficult to interpret things. We talked about a minute ago the problems with Nostradamus, right? But even just in our own time, let's not talk about 500 years. Let's just talk about 6 months from now. Think about how you would decide, is Egypt doing well or is it going downhill? That's not such an easy question. In many senses, it's just a human opinion. Any thoughts on that, Oolong?
I was just wanted to go back to one of the points you talked about earlier, where you might be honing in on some of the constructs in the Akashic records. I'm wondering, have you ever heard the story of Ed Dames and Santa Claus?
Yes, of course. It's very famous.
Yeah, so that again just goes to show how complicated things are, because you could easily just be inadvertently targeting junk in the Akashic record. So I guess that's another real big limitation with remote viewing.
Yeah, although it might be for all psychic stuff.
Yeah, fair enough.
And for those who don't know the story, Ed Dames is Dr. Doom, right? He's the famous guy who goes on coast to coast and has a negative view of the immediate future or long-term future. And he was in the remote viewing program. And the people in the program essentially wanted to play a trick on him because he's Dr. Doom, right? And so they set it up in such a way that it would seem that there was this attack coming from across the North Pole down into Canada and the U.S. And so, oh my God, we're under like nuclear missile attack, right? And he's always looking at the doom side of things. And that's what he's seeing. But actually, it was Santa Claus coming down. And, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and all that.
Oh, boy.
And the point is that, and I think you see this with his life, actually, is the question of the cup of water being half full or half empty, right? And I was kind of getting at that with Egypt a minute ago. But, like, for example, if somebody went to Melody and said, half my family is in Egypt and I want to know, should they move here to Ireland or should they stay? What's the economy in Egypt going to be like? Or what's the situation in Egypt going to be like a year from now? Well, that's not so simple because it may be a little worse, but the situation in Ireland might be a little worse. I mean, you know what I mean. What are your standards?
It's actually several different questions too. That's
of course.
If somebody came to me and said that, the first thing I would tell them is, well, what we need to look at is preferably each family member's personal circumstance, or at least even if we have to do them as a group, we can do that. But it's not always what the economy of either place is doing. It's where you will thrive best, where you and yours are going to do best.
Exactly. That's what I'm trying to say. Is Dr. Doom is going to see this disease coming out of Africa killing millions. And let's say he's right, okay? Or some wheat blight or whatever, something coming out that kills a lot of people. And let's say it kills millions of people. Okay, but there are 7 billion people on Earth, right? There have always been diseases. There have always been wars, right? It's not the end of civilization if a new disease comes out of some place like Africa or the Amazon or something and kills 2 million people. I mean, it's a tragedy. I mean, for sure. But it is certainly not the end of modern civilization. And that was why the folks in the military kind of did that to tease him, right? Is he would just immediately jump to the worst possible conclusion, because let's say you have something flying down from the North Pole towards the U.S. What else can it be other than Russian missiles, right? It's got to be Russian missiles, right? So your monkey mind is saying, oh my God, we're under attack. It's all over. Nuclear war. The war's, I mean, this is unbelievably grim, right? And so they pulled that trick on him. Because now, granted, hopefully, we're going to assume there is no Santa Claus, right? So it's a bit of a dirty trick, I suppose. But it only worked because he was such a Dr. Doom. And I think that's another limitation that we have to put in this, is that, not that long ago, I talked to somebody from Eastern Europe who'd moved to the U.S., 15 years ago. And, my general impression was, I mean, I liked her, nice enough gal, but basically she had a, how can I put it? I don't know if you say depressed view, but she was going to be of the same mindset whether she was in Eastern Europe or the U.S., right? It wasn't the U.S. that was the issue, economically speaking. She came from a hard place, and then it was a little bit less hard where she ended up. Right? But my point is, she's constantly talking about bad things, right? And it's just her personality. It's not like the U.S. had suddenly collapsed. Objectively speaking, life was tougher in Eastern Europe. And anyway, I think that's kind of the issue here, is that people see something and they judge it, and these are human opinions.
So, can I ask a question, Blaine?
Sure.
Why do you think so many of these seers zero in on doom and destruction and, the apocalypse? Or is that just what all that we remember? Is that what people want to know about, and that's what people remember them for? And I have a second part to that question too, and that is, do you think there's certain events that the universe doesn't want us to perceive?
Well, now you ask that second question.
That's philosophical.
You needed to ask that earlier in the show. We're going to run out of time here. Oh boy. Well, as far as are there things that the universe doesn't want us to see, that's entirely possible. That might be. There may be things that we're not meant to see because, you know, it's hard to say. I don't have an answer, but I don't know that anybody has an answer, to be honest. We can only speculate on that one. Let's see. What was the first part of the question?
Why do you think so many of the historical seers? Yeah, the doom and gloom.
Well, first of all, doom and gloom sells, right? So it's going to be put down and told to others, and right?
Yeah.
So there's that element of it.
Do we have a death wish as a society, and is that why we cling to it?
Well, you know, this is an interesting question, because the other side of that would be, for, you know, not talking about Nostradamus, but I would say for the last 100 years, it's been reasonable to say that if we take this path that we're on, it's not going to lead to a happy ending, right? I mean, can you really just totally destroy the oceans and cut down all the forests? Is that really a reasonable thing to do? Right? So I think a lot of us subconsciously just feel like things are not going the right way. And maybe we take that and then we build a construct around it that the rapture is coming or something. Maybe I don't know. This is a long philosophical discussion.
Yeah, I guess we just put ourselves into a negative feedback loop, maybe.
Yeah, but I think that when positive things happen, I don't think they get recorded as much. I mean, if somebody says, you know, he's got like a 12-year-old daughter and he's got some vision, and then it's like, oh, she's going to have this beautiful wedding. I see it. It's like this. It's going to be here. It's going to be here. It's going to be here. And then later that happens, right? 15 years later, exactly as he saw it, happens, right? This isn't written in very many books, is it?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, as I said, it's just not going to sell, is it? So I think there's that element of doom sells better, and so it gets reported more.
Yeah, I think you're right. I've noticed that, and I made jokes about it actually to family members and whatnot, that I've noticed that on those days when there is really good energy and, you know, things are really, for the most part, going pretty good, especially for individuals, I get very little feedback. But I'll get like lots and lots and lots of comments on my Facebook page, and sometimes at the forum and different places, or on my website, if some, like a really doomer forecast, if it's a really disaster cat type forecast. And, you know, I tend to be a little doomy anyway. I sort of sympathize with Ed Dame, so I think he goes way too far. If I ever think I'm being too doomy, I just go listen to him for 5 minutes, and then I know that I've really got a more positive outlook on life. But, you know, poor man. But again, there is this tendency. I have been known to misread things that, the example of the San Francisco example, that was a tragedy, but it wasn't the end of the city either. It is a great example, but still, I really think that people are just more interested. It's more, I told my husband, it's like little kids, you know, when they're very small and you go, boo, and they go, that scared me when, and then they come back, they say, do it again.
Yes.
Right.
They really, you know, my clients and people, it's like that, you know. It's like when I have a particularly doomy or forecast, I just can't avoid making doomy. I'll just say, well, you know, scare me again, you know, because those are the ones that get all the hits. I think it's just partly human nature.
Yeah, Oolong, in the last 50 years, how many movies have been like The Sound of Music or something? I don't know. How many have been like like happy, healthy families dancing on green fields in the mountains, right?
Yeah,
And then
not all.
how many have been zombie apocalypse, or disaster apocalypse, or alien apocalypse, or something, right? I mean, it just seems to be. What can I say? I mean, how can you describe the popularity of Russian novelists, right? Um, just kidding, just kidding. Um, I like them, but the point is that, I mean, it's not very upbeat, so to speak, right? So I think it's just human nature that we remember and focus on that kind of, what can I say, rapture kind of disaster, end of the world kind of thing. And as a friend of mine said, who is pretty good in some of this psychic stuff and astrology and whatever, he said, look, there's an apocalypse going on, or an Armageddon, I think is his word, going on all the time somewhere. Right? I mean, it's going on in Cambodia, or it's going on in Rwanda, or it's going on wherever. It's going on in Syria. Look, the world is full of really terrible, terrible things if you want to focus on that small part that gets it at that given time. And, I mean, look at, for example, in the forum that we have, how, an economic thing in the scheme of things in, let's say, the United States or in the EU is really, in a sense, blown out of proportion. I mean, it's like Bernanke said this. And it's like, well, okay, so what? He says a lot of things, right? Don't get me wrong. The economy may be really heading down overall going forward. But I'm just saying that it may be that the people focusing on that had a tough day at work, or, something important to them is not going so well. A tenant left someplace they're renting out or something like that. And so they're taking their personal hardships, and they're saying that it applies across the board to the whole country or the whole Western world, and it probably doesn't. Having said that, I think the general direction is down, but I'm just trying to say that, as I said, doom sells, and it attracts people. And I'm not totally different. I mean, I'm interested in it more than perhaps I should be. I think I'm the one, reading the Russian novels, right? So it's my own damn fault. But still, and Ed Dames is a guy who's just, regrets that he wasn't born in the Soviet Union, because then there'd be even more doom, right? Right? Okay, I'm teasing. He's a nice enough guy. But anyway, so Oolong, regarding that, the doom it's an attractor to people. It's just attractive. What can I say? It's human nature. And then the philosophical thing of, it's going to take a long time to discuss some of that, so we'll just leave it at that. Anyway, I think it's time to kind of wrap up today's edition. I want to do another show or two on related things. Basically, Ingo Swann's idea of the bio-mind superpowers that all humans have. And I think that's exactly right. I think we have, dozens of senses and all kinds of superpowers, and I want to have a show discussing that, and maybe another one. But for today, I think we can wrap it up here. Any closing thoughts, Herm?
I had a question for Melanie. It's a very naive one. It has to do, I guess, with what I would call psychic noise, and I guess I'd define it as someone who comes to you, for example, and do you ever find that there are, very occasional people that just you can't get, you feel like you can't get a handle on them, on their question, and it's repeatable over time? Has that ever happened? Are there certain people that are just harder to spot, so to speak?
Yeah, and rarely, occasionally, like, I will just say, I'm sorry, this isn't working. More often what I have to do is I'd have to work very hard. I use the cards, and sometimes I really don't know. The person may go through the whole reading. The people I find the most difficult both have that kind of I won't call it psychic noise. I should say call it psychic blank. You know,
Blank, okay.
I'm just not getting much. And often there are the people that come and they just say you say, well, can I help you? And they'll say, I just want a general reading. And they're not saying anything. They're just, particularly old Irish farmers or, occasionally other people, they just sit there and they may leave and they pay me and I have no idea if I've helped them or not, or if I said anything that was correct. It's even worse when doing this over the phone, because I do phone readings. And there have been a number of times when I had a really hard time getting a handle on it. And at the end, I don't know whether the person went away, satisfied or at least helped or not. I really hate those. But, it's just going to happen because some people, any one psychic is just not going to resonate with. Some people you just cannot read. I mean, and I've been known to refer people to. Sometimes when I get this sense before they even come through my door. And if that happens, I just say, I have this friend over here. She's really good. And I think you might do better with her because they're particularly people who, at the very least, are entertaining. And I'm interesting, but I'm not necessarily entertaining in that sense when I'm doing readings.
Melody, is there any evidence for sidereal time being quite relevant for, let's say, runes or tarot or something like that? Because in remote viewing, there's absolutely overwhelming evidence that sidereal time affects the results.
Okay, I think your vocabulary is larger than mine. What is sidereal time?
Well, I tell you what. Why don't we put this in the show next time that we get into some of these details, because that's the lineup of the Earth versus the center of the galaxy, basically. And it's quite interesting, but there seems to be a psychic impact of some force that, what shall we say, comes from the center of the galaxy, the lineup, whether it be electromagnetic or something we don't understand. And it's been documented quite effectively and for a long, long time in remote viewing. Now, so you understand, it's not 100%. So you understand.
Yeah, and see, I knew what it was, but I didn't know the term. But that would be perfect for another show, because one thing we didn't get into that I wanted to ask you about, and I have some ideas too, but is the difference between reading for either in remote viewing or in other forms of future viewing of human events versus great like geological and universal sort of and planetary events, which I think things like earthquakes, volcanoes, planetary alignments, where's the center of the galaxy, this kind of thing. And does there seem to be a difference when reading for those as opposed to human events and timing and things? I think it'd be a very interesting topic.
Yes. Okay, moving on. Any last thoughts, Oolong?
Yeah, I'm beginning to wonder if the apocalypse and the end times isn't just a great cosmic joke that the universe is playing on us all, and maybe it doesn't even exist.
In other words, it's to tease us.
More or less. That was to go along with my philosophical comment that maybe there's things the universe doesn't want us to perceive.
I think you've been reading Russian novels.
Well, Oolong, you're almost as pessimistic as I am, right?
You got a few more years on me, though, playing.
Yeah,
There's always time.
So, that's true, But, I would just say that very few people I've met, actually nobody, is as cynical as I am. What was that quote from? Was it Lily Tomlinson from the?
Oh yes,
about keeping up. The more cynical I, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to keep up, right? The more cynical I become, it's still not enough, right? Because the world just shows me that I wasn't cynical enough in my earlier days, right? So that cosmic joke, the joke is just getting more and more painful as you get older.
Well, look at the bright side, though, because as one gets older, and one's eyes begin to fail, I guess the message there is that maybe one should look inside rather than out for answers. Who knows?
Yeah, that's an upbeat thing. And actually, though, Oolong, you're talking about it like it's this tease and all these problems, but as Herm just said, maybe the answer is we need to, in a sense, focus more on that which is not so obviously seen. right?
Yes.
The more painfully obvious it is in front of us, right? The latest whatever star in Hollywood or something does something ridiculous or something, right? The more obvious and promoted it is, the less valuable it is for us. And we need to focus on these kind of unseen skills and superpowers and stuff like that. And a lot of them certainly don't require, massive training in the sense of like going to a class or something. They may just be something that comes out of meditation, right? And that's, of course, something you discuss in your series of shows, right?
Yeah.
And that may indeed be one of the highest, most valuable things of them all. But anyway, I think we can wrap it up for this time. And I thank everyone for attending. Herm, Oolong, Melody, glad you could make it. And I guess that'll do it. Take care, folks.
Thank you for listening to The Plain Truth on Time Monk Radio. And please be sure to tune in next week as we navigate our way through life extension, waiting for Kissinger's wake. Good night.